Hello, everyone, and welcome. I apologize for the delay in getting you an actual lecture. I have managed to invest in a new camera, and that didn't do me any good. So I invested in new software, and hopefully that will make things go a little bit more smoothly on my end as well as on yours. The last time that we left off, I believe that we had done a history of the effects of communication technology changes on politics. And today what I want to do is go back and start where your syllabus says 1960. And I'm going to talk about a few of the changes that occurred between 1960 and 1992. At least that's my goal for today, and hopefully that will work, and hopefully this new software will do what I think it's supposed to do. Okay, so let's start with 1960, and you're going to probably ask why 1960. The answer to that question is that that's really when we ushered in the new age of presidential rhetoric. So it also impacted state and local elections as time marched on. So we're going to see what changes at the top filter down through to the lower late races, or the smaller races. They're not really lower so much as they're different and they are not national. So 1960 is also a good spot because it's the first time that television is really utilized for the presidential debates, and to see the presidents in some way other than just a news broadcast or clips of what the presidents are doing at the time. So it's less formal in the sense that there's going to be interaction between the candidates, and the audience will get to witness that if they were able to afford a TV at the time. Now, most of this, of course, was in black and white. The people who were watching it, I mean, in order to get color, you kind of had to be there. So this was in black and white. There are a lot of things that people said about the televised presidential debates that I think are interesting and important to understand. And it's also important to understand what we know was correct and what we know was incorrect, at least based on what we know now, as opposed to what was known then. First of all, you may have heard a lot of people say, well, anybody who watched the debate felt that John F. Kennedy won the debate, and anybody who listened to the debate on radio thought that Richard Nixon was actually the winner. This, if true, would suggest that what people are saying, that's to say, you only hear the president on the radio. You only hear a congressperson on the radio. You don't see them. What that would indicate is that their content was far more important than the way that they looked. Of course, if you look at the other side of that, then people who watched it on television paid more attention to how a person looked and how they presented rather than what they had to say. So for many years, we actually believed that study to be true until we found out a few things and really broke down how much we know about what happened in 1960. There are several things of the time period, technology-wise, that make it very difficult to truly know whether or not television audiences or radio audiences differed that greatly. One of the first things that we have to acknowledge is that they did these surveys of who won based on telephones. Now, is it true that more people had telephones or access to a telephone than TVs? Yes, that is absolutely true, but it leaned toward the richer people who had a telephone and a television. So you might have a phone and a radio, but it was less likely. If you could afford anything, if you were in the mid class to the lower classes, you were actually using the radio and probably didn't use a telephone that often just yet. So what we end up with is a real skew in the data, because most of the people who are answering these questions were sort of the rich and those who were, of course, then better educated, because that followed in the 1960s. And that meant that they were paying attention to different things, but more importantly, that they were able to see John Kennedy versus Richard Nixon. And we know now that that is a flawed study. I mean, that is greatly flawed. There's no way to truly know whether one medium had an impact over another just because of the nature of the surveys. If they had gone around knocking on doors, it might be a very different outcome that we would understand better. But the truth of the matter is that it probably is irrelevant, because by the time we had the next set of debates, especially, we had color. More people were able to afford those. There was a 12-year gap, which I'll get to in just a second. And so there were a lot of things about those first presidential debates that were very unique. The other thing that they did, and we don't really do this anymore, and again, we'll get to this, is they had topics that people understood what the topics were going to be: domestic policy, foreign policy, and economics. And those were the three debates that the presidents had. The vice presidents, I do not believe, debated at that time. But the presidents had this very specific, laid out set of topics. They did not know the questions beforehand. And therefore, these two men, if you ever get the opportunity to watch a little bit of this, these are two men who are speaking off the cuff. There's no teleprompters. There's no message cards in front of them. There's no one telling them what to say. And if I recall correctly, there's no commercial breaks. They just debated each other for 90 minutes. And they had one person from the press there to ask them questions. Why is all of that important? Because the technology impacted what format could be used. They had 3 stationary cameras, one that could see the entirety of the stage, one that was focused on Richard Nixon, and one that was focused on John Kennedy. And did John Kennedy look better than Richard Nixon? Was Richard Nixon sweating and John Kennedy looked tanned and toned and right off the yacht? There's a lot of questions about what the technology did and how it changed our perceptions of those candidates. I'm going to admit something here. I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old. Obviously, I wasn't around for this debate, and I, had to watch it basically online. Well, I won't say online. I had access to a database at the time, the Guggenheim database for all political communication, which was very, very cool. So at the time, I was one of the few that got to watch it. And of course, if you're a nerd like me, you sat down and watched them. And here's my problem. I kept looking to try to see which one of these guys looked better. And in black and white, everybody looks the same to me. That sounds terrible, but it's kind of hard to tell skin tone, sweating, and all that stuff from me, because my eyes are for color television, and generally a sharper picture than even what you're seeing now, obviously, right? And we just keep getting better and better pictures. Black and white, it was, snowy and fuzzy, and I don't know whether or not one looked better than the other. I'm not saying they weren't both, but that neither of them looked a certain way. I mean, obviously John Kennedy was much younger than Richard Nixon, and that gave him an advantage, I guess, automatically with me. Or perhaps it's because I was raised in the Northeast. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why I might lean that way. But the truth of the matter is, when I watched them, I really could not tell you what the difference in perception of their looks and their nonverbals was. However, what I can tell you is that both of them were extremely good debaters. Both of them were extremely good public speakers. And therefore, you really had to sit down and listen to what they had to say and have some base of knowledge to understand what they were saying in order to follow the debate, in order to know who was, quote unquote, winning that debate. And the truth of the matter is when I watch those debates, I don't see one or the other winning. I see them both telling us their ideas and their sides of issues, but I do not declare a winner there. Because politically, obviously, I'm going to say the winner is whoever I agree with. And that's not the way to evaluate a debate like that, because not everybody agrees. I know that's a shocker. And what's even more important here for us to understand, and actually this is fascinating, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan debated each other in college. Okay, so get a sense of that for a second. They were the same age, roughly. They debated against each other when they were in college. And I would have loved to see that, when they were younger, and what they were doing with that. But most of the presidents that debate after 1960, when they're on television to a certain time period, and I don't know, people disagree about when that time is. We'll talk about it here soon. That they just started going a little bit off the rails, all right? And that may be due to technology, that may be due to the candidates themselves. That's part of what we're going to be discussing here. So in 1960, we have the first televised debates. We have, information coming out that declare that John Kennedy won just because he was good looking and young, which at that time didn't really make a whole heck of a lot of sense. And so I'm kind of glad we disproved that theory that television's better than the radio. That's just not necessarily true. And we know that today now. And in addition, this is really the first time we get to see two presidential candidates interact at the same time in the same space. And the American people, of course, a lot of people watched these. There was no recording of these. They were live. So, if Richard Nixon was sweating up a storm, or if John Kennedy had to run to the restroom, they couldn't. They were on television, and that's the way that went. So it's important for us to understand the difference in editing technology as well as the filming technology or the recording technology, because Guggenheim was really the only people, I believe, at the time who were able to get that film, because television was still running on film, and or it was still using magnetic tape at the time to run. So I'm not sure if I just confused you or not, but not very many people have seen or saw that debate until we had access to them, like on YouTube, which is where I get it, and some other places where you can access these sort of historical events. But in 1960, there were several things that had to be done in order to make these debates possible. First of all, both of them had to have clearance. Both of them had to have their Secret Service with them. Yes, when you're a candidate, you get protection from the Secret Service. Both of them had to have, aside from the time in their schedule, the ability to get onto camera at the same time. They also had to have some input in the topic areas, which they did, but they did not have questions that they could request. The person who did the questions was the person who picked the questions, who wrote the questions, who asked the questions, and that's that. So in 1960, though, another big thing had to happen in order to have those debates, and that was the suspension of Section 316 of the Fairness Doctrine. For those of you who are aware of media law, you know that in that it says that if one political party has time in the media, whether that's on radio or on television, you have to offer equal time to the other side, to the other candidates that are running for that position. Well, there were some people running for president other than John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, but they were the only two who were believed to be viable. And so only those two got on television, but they had to suspend that section 316 that says that you get equal time, because the other candidates, whoever they were, they were not going to get that time. And so it was suspended temporarily. And if there was going to be another debate, presidential debate or a congressional debate, they would have had to suspend it by an act of Congress, I believe. It wasn't just like the president or somebody raised their hand and said, okay, it's suspended. There was a full vote that had to be taken, and things of that measure. So in 1960, that is the only presidential debate set that we see for another 12 years. Part of that is the Fairness Doctrine, and part of that is the geopolitics of the world at the time. The next time that we actually see a presidential debate will be 1972. I'm pretty sure you guys could have done the math to figure out that it was 12 years later. This was not because John Kennedy was president for 12 years, obviously. Even though he won that election for 1960, he was shot in 1963. And we had two other presidents in between there, including Richard Nixon. So what, I'm sorry, I have a hard time with the whole Richard Nixon thing because I was born in 74. So I always joke that I was born when he was president, but he was on his way out pretty quickly after that. But in 1972, they suspended the equal time, Section 316. They got rid of, again, any third-party candidates. They were not allowed to be in the presidential debates. And of course, we have, in 1972, that would have been Jimmy Carter. And Richard Nixon. So I believe that's correct. Someone's going to have to check me. Remember, I was not born yet, and that does not mean I should not know my history. I should. But I believe I have that correctly. So, of course, Richard Nixon wins, and so we don't pay attention to who lost. We call those people that also ran, we call them, and this is brilliant, also rans. So if you ever hear someone refer to an also ran, that means that it's a person who also ran for that particular position and, didn't get elected. So we do continue to have the debates then from 1972 to 1976 to 1980, which is the first one I truly remember with Ronald Reagan. And I don't remember who was in that first one. Walter Mondale was one, and Michael Dukakis was one, and I believe that Dukakis would have been 84. It's confusing for me because I don't remember who also ran, as they say, all the time. I do remember that 1984 was one of the worst campaign seasons ever in history. Because it was considered one of the worst for mudslinging, one of the worst for vitriol. And I don't know how that measures up to today because our advertising is so different. There are some political advertisements from the 1960s that I'm going to post for you that I would love for you to comment on. There's one particular one that gets stuck in my head, and if it gets stuck in there, it's worse than an earworm because I can't get it out of my head for days, and I'll let you figure out which one that is when I show those to you. There were political advertisements going on in 1960 and obviously in the 70s. There were actually, and I'm talking about televised ads here. Now, what they did for the most part was they said, okay, we're going to take radio ads and basically put them on television with some graphics. And obviously, for most of you, you probably already know how badly that would come out if we just did that. If we just, it's kind of like taking a class that's never been taught online. It's always been taught in the classroom, and you say, I'm just going to make it online, make it so. You can't just take that class and put it online. There's changes to the assignments, there's changes to the lecture structure, there's changes to the expectations on deadlines and things of that nature. So the same thing happens if you want to, quote, take something from radio and just slap it onto the television. You can't do it quite that easily. But we did have political ads, most of them in black and white, for a good period of time because color cost more to run those ads. They did not spend nearly the amount of money that is spent on political ads now. I was actually just talking to someone about this particular thing, not necessarily in terms of 1960, but just in terms of 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, I knew people that were running for school board. And this year, some of you know, I am running for school board in Nixa. And my competitors have all raised $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, in some cases $6,000 for an unpaid service that you're willing to take your time to provide. That's fine by me. Please, by all means, feel free to spend all that money if you want. I am not the type of person to take money from people and say, okay, I'm going to spend this on a campaign to run for school board, even though I don't get paid for it, and you're not going to get anything back from me for it. The only service you're going to get is what I can do for the students at Nixa School in Nixa School District. So the reason I bring that up, though, is because to me, that's a ridiculous thing that we have to spend all this money from donations on this election. And there was a time 10 years ago, maybe even 8 years ago or 7, where you didn't spend any money on a school board election. That was just not done. Or a commissioner's race, or any of these municipal sort of, well, I won't say not all municipal, because city council's always been fairly competitive. However, not to this extent. And obviously those numbers are multiplied by millions, tens of millions, when you get into a presidential race, and how crazy it costs, how much crazy money it costs to run for even a state senator who gets paid a ludicrously low amount of money to become a state senator. I'm not talking U.S. senator here. I'm just talking about your state senators, your state representatives. It's not a ton of money. Most people have to have either independent wealth, or they have to know, or they have to be married to someone, or living with someone who has enough money to support their household while that person goes and serves in Congress. So I don't know how much you know about all that, but money in politics is very important. In the 1960s, it was important in a different way than in the 1970s, honestly, than it was in the 1980s and until today. So in 1972, we have a debate that occurs the same way as they did in 1960. However, the geopolitics of the world and the suspension of Section 316 allowed this to actually, I keep saying 316, and now that I'm thinking about it, I think it's actually Section 315. I feel terrible for that. Sorry about that. I believe it's actually Section 315. So I say that, I don't know why, in the middle of this lecture, it just came to me like, no, I think that's wrong. So that suspension happened again, and it continued to happen for every presidential race since. So in the 1970s, they still had the topics of a foreign debate, a domestic debate, and an economic debate. And that carried through, and things don't really change until about 1992. Now, one thing that did change, and I believe this was in 1972 as well, is we started having vice presidential debates. And that was kind of interesting, we think, sort of to people, just because if something happened to the president, you wanted to know who was going to be taking over. And, even though that's a very rare thing these days, they had just lost a president in 1963, and the vice president had to step up, which he did. So this was very fresh in the minds of the voters, that they should know who their vice presidents are, in case they ever went through this again. And for those of you who don't know, in 1981, I believe it was 1981, yeah, because he was president. President Reagan was shot. He was shot at, and he was shot. And he lived, obviously, but it was very, very new. It was sort of shortly into his not very far into his presidency. And we've had that happen with a lot of presidents. There have been assassination attempts that never even went anywhere. Obviously John Kennedy, but then, and there were a few prior to that through the 17 and 1800s, but really the John Kennedy death really spurred a conversation about the safety and security of the President of the United States. And that in turn changed how they campaigned, including presidential debates, including how often they went out into the public and so on. In 1981, the attempt on Ronald Reagan wasn't successful in that it didn't kill him, but he was injured in that shooting. So it's important to remember sort of global or, global or local, national, the culture of those things impacted the political, what the effect was from political technology. So in 1960, you have, in the 1930s, of course, you have the radio come in with fireside chats with FDR. But in 1960, you have this big change to televisions, again, limited to only those who had televisions and could afford them. Now, by 1972, more people had televisions. Most people still had black and white televisions. Color really wasn't common until the mid-1970s. And in fact, my mom, I had a black and white TV when I was a kid with the rabbit ears and the whole deal. I still keep rabbit ears around just for, for fun, because they're cute. If you don't know what rabbit ears are, those are the traditional old antenna that you would just pull them up, plug them into the television, and you could grab a signal out of the sky. So I still have those, and black and white television I no longer have. They used to have these little small black and white televisions that you could like hang under your microwave at the house, or for me, I had it in my bedroom. Please don't tell my mom that. She still doesn't know, I don't think. There were things that that kids do now that we never would have been able to get away with, because of course now I just take my phone to bed and I can turn on whatever TV show or whatever podcast or whatnot music that I want to. But back then, this was kind of a big deal. As more households, let's go with that. As more households got more TVs, the link between a candidate for any office and the citizens who would vote for them became a lot closer. And so we started feeling like we had a relationship with our leaders. And this is important. Some of you may have studied parasocial relationships. That idea that we have a relationship in and to characters on a television show. There are some television shows that have gone completely meta with this, by the way. But you've probably seen this. I mean, we all do it. I do it. We feel like we're a part of something that's happening on our television, or we integrate that into our lives in some way. If you ever see me in person, you will notice a few things about me that probably definitely came from the Supernatural television show. A lot of people put, Star Wars emblems for tattoos, and we wear clothing that represents the show Friends or whatever. We relate our music to television and the people who appear on television. And back in my day when I was, from birth until the time I was about 30, I had a parasocial relationship with our news broadcasters. I knew who my weather person was. I knew where he lived. I knew where some of the newscasters lived. We felt like we had a relationship with them and we trusted them. Therefore, if it's on TV, it must be true, is a saying that we had back then when television was relatively new. I know what you're thinking. They did the same thing with the internet. I read it on the internet, so it must be true. And of course, they're both equally likely to be true, I guess. You may have a better shot with the television sometimes, at least back in the 1970s and 80s. But we trusted our newscasters, Dan Rather and others, to tell us the truth. And a big part of that came from Watergate. But what that also did for us is that whenever we would see a president or a presidential candidate or a candidate for Congress or someone speaking on television who was running for office, be it municipal, local, or be it national, we trusted them. We felt we could trust them because we've seen what they look like. We know how they talk. We know what they sound like. We can imagine them doing the work. and we have a parasocial relationship with them. That is to say, outside of, even society, but a relationship nonetheless. Our identity becomes relatable to, or related to, that person on the television. There are simple things that prove that this is true, by the way. If you ever knew someone who liked Twilight, I am not that person, but if you knew someone who liked Twilight, they might have like a button or a sticker or a tattoo or whatever that says Team Edward, or Team Jacob, I think was his name. I don't remember the werewolf's name. But for me, people who know me pretty well, they're like, are you a Dean girl or a Sam girl? It's like, oh my God, I'm a Dean girl all the way. No problem, right? Even our identities are related to the things that we watch on television. And that is not just the fictional things, but it really happened with the non-fictional things. So these presidential debates became an introduction. It built a relationship with the voters for the candidates. That will become incredibly important when we talk about 1992 and the presidential election in 1992. In the 1960 to the 88 presidential candidacies, we had a woman who ran for vice president, so she did in fact debate. Those rules were really interesting. We did have, these are not technological impacts, by the way. We did have debates every single election for the presidency. We did have some congressional debates. Most of those were not televised, but there were congressional debates that people attended, newspapers reported on, and so on. Obviously, people in Pennsylvania didn't care much about what was happening in Texas or, in Illinois, but like today, I could probably go onto YouTube and find any congressional debate that I want to. Back then, that wasn't really important to most voters. They wanted to know about their local issues, their state issues, their federal issues, and they didn't want to worry about what Texas was doing or what Minnesota was doing or whatnot. So we have a more localized focus, which made it easier to understand what those candidates were talking about and referencing. Also, all politics were local, of course, until about 1988, when things start to shift a little bit. And the next time that we talk, we will get into what changed in 1988 and how that's going to sort of set the stage for the 2000s, and then the next big change. And I'll let you guess when that next big change is going to happen after 2000. Now, before I go, I'm just going to tell you that I'm going to post some of these advertisements. I may link a little bit of the John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon debate for you, just in case you want to watch it. That's not required. But I want to give you some of these things to start to understand how the technology of the television really shifted our view of political candidates. And then I'm going to also assign you a reading to get us to the 1992 presidential election, and also talk about the technological changes and how that impacted the way that citizens received information from the candidates, which of course is really what we want to get into. All right, everybody, I hope that helps a little bit for clarifying. Again, I apologize for the late lecture part, but I think we got the camera going. You'll have to let me know if it's any better on the quality. And I will talk to you all soon. If you have any questions, of course, as always, you may email or you may put it on Blackboard. Of course, the fastest way is to text me if that's an option that's available to you. And I will talk to you all later.